The 500-word hook. Imagine you are standing in a room with a master profiler. They aren't looking at your face. They are looking at the micro shifts in your posture, the baseline of your breathing, and the precise moment your vocal pitch drops 3 semitones. They are reading your psychological architecture. Now, imagine that same clinical lens turned on the most volatile, silent war in modern human relationships. The exact moment an avoidant and a healed empath both execute the no-contact rule. This is not a standard breakup. This is a profound, systemic disruption of a subconscious loop. When a standard relationship ends, there is noise. There are texts, late-night calls, and predictable emotional negotiations. But when these two specific archetypes pull the plug and retreat into absolute silence, the air changes. It is a subvocal chess match where neither side is moving a piece, yet the entire board is vibrating. Most relationship advice tells you that silence makes the heart grow fonder, or that someone will crack. That is a surface-level narrative designed for comfort. The reality is far more clinical, far more calculating, and entirely counterintuitive. In this analysis, we are stripping away the emotional sentimentality. We are going to look at the raw mechanics of human behavioral tracking. What actually happens inside the neurological wiring of an avoidant when their primary source of intuitive compliance, the empath, suddenly drops off the grid? What happens to the empath when they stop projecting their internal warmth onto a blank canvas and instead lock down their emotional borders? If you have ever found yourself locked in this specific, agonizing, silent standoff, or if you are currently trying to navigate the aftermath of a dynamic that felt more like a covert psychological operation than a romance, you need to understand the underlying architecture of what comes next. Because what happens next isn't just a waiting game. It is a total recalibration of power. If you leave this presentation early, you will likely fall back into the standard traps, misreading their silence as victory, or worse, misreading your own agony as weakness. Stay until the final metric, because by the end of this breakdown, you will not only understand the exact timeline of the avoidant psychological collapse, but you will also possess the precise behavioral blueprint to recognize when a silent boundary has become your ultimate weapon of self-sovereignty. Let's look at the metrics. Look at the person next to you. If you were to stop speaking to them right now, how long before the discomfort becomes a physical weight in the room? Silence is a variable. It is never empty. It is always heavy with whatever was left unsaid. But when we look at the behavioral profiles of an avoidant attachment style and a highly intuitive empath, silence isn't just a lack of noise. It is an active psychological ecosystem. Most people view no contact as a waiting period, a romantic game of chicken to see who blinks first. That is an amateur assessment. Today, we are going to dissect this through a clinical lens. We are going to look at the hidden mechanics, the weaponized behavioral loops, and the exact neurological shifts that occur when both of these archetypes simultaneously shut the door and lock it from the inside. If you listen to the mainstream narrative, you'll be told to just move on and focus on yourself. But if you don't understand the underlying architecture of why this specific silence feels like withdrawal from a chemical substance, you will remain trapped in the loop. You will misinterpret their behavior, you will miscalculate your own progress, and you will likely break the boundary at the exact moment the psychological tide is turning. To truly decode this covert war of attrition, we must look past the emotions and analyze the raw, predictable metrics of human behavior. In the initial stage, let's call it day 1 through day 14, the behavioral baselines of these two individuals move in completely opposite directions. For the avoidant, the immediate aftermath of entering no contact triggers a phenomenon known as deactivation relief. To them, the empath's constant bids for connection, their emotional transparency, and their demand for depth felt like an existential threat to autonomy. When the silence drops, the avoidant's nervous system drops its cortisol levels. They feel an intense, almost euphoric surge of freedom. They believe they have won. They perceive the silence as their own strength, a successful defense of their borders. But look at the empath during this exact same window. The empath system is in acute neurobiological shock. For months, or perhaps years, their brain has been wired to read the microsignals of the avoidant, attempting to soothe the avoidant's hidden anxiety. When that target disappears, the empath's empathy loop has nowhere to land. It reflects inward, mutating into self-doubt, rumination, and systemic grief. The empath is operating in total transparency. They are feeling every ounce of the vacuum. But physics dictates that a vacuum cannot exist indefinitely without drawing something into it. As we move past the 3-week mark, the structural integrity of the avoidance defense mechanism begins to show microfractures. Human beings are hardwired for baseline consistency. When the empath was chasing, testing, or crying, they provided a predictable data stream. The avoidant knew exactly where the empath stood. That knowledge, ironically, allowed the avoidant to feel safe enough to stay distant. But when the empath goes genuinely no contact, meaning zero digital footprints, no mutual friend inquiries, no passive-aggressive status updates, the data stream goes completely dark. This is where the avoidant encounters the phantom phase. Without the emotional pressure from the empath, the avoidant's justification for staying detached begins to evaporate. They can no longer say, "I am distant," because they are too demanding. The demand is gone. Therefore, the distance must now be looked at for what it truly is, their own core wound. Suddenly, the silence stops feeling like freedom and begins to feel like rejection. While the avoidant is entering this stage of cognitive dissonance, a profound transformation is occurring within the empath, provided they have crossed the threshold into becoming a healed empath. Initially, the empath's primary vulnerability was their tendency to tolerate boundary violations in favor of maintaining the connection. But true no contact forces a hard pivot from external monitoring to internal containment. The empath stops projecting their warmth into the void. They realize that their empathy was being used as an emotional buffer for someone who refused to step onto the field. When an empath weaponizes their attention by completely withdrawing it, they reclaim their psychological sovereignty. The focus shifts from, "Why are they doing this?" to, "Why did I allow myself to be measured by someone who couldn't even see the scale?" The emotional output drops to zero. The empath's baseline stabilizes. They are no longer a variable in the avoidance game. They have become a fixed, immovable coordinate. What happens next is highly predictable. When the avoidant realizes the empath is not returning to the loop, their anxiety spikes. Because they lack the behavioral tools for direct, vulnerable communication, they will begin to utilize covert proxemics. They will perform low-exposure behaviors designed to test the waters without risking rejection. A casual like on an old post, a vague text message about an unresolved or trivial matter, or appearing in spaces they know the empath frequents. These aren't signs of healing, they are diagnostic probes. They are checking to see if the compliance loop is still functional. If the empath responds with immediate warmth, the avoidance anxiety is relieved, the data stream is restored, and they will almost immediately revert to their baseline of avoidance. But if both parties maintain no contact, if the empath refuses to acknowledge the covert probes, the avoidant hits a wall of psychological deflation. They are forced to confront the reality that their silence didn't control the situation. It ended it. When an avoidant and an empath both commit to the silence, it is the ultimate test of psychological architecture. For the avoidant, it is a mirror they have spent a lifetime running from. For the empath, it is the crucible in which their sensitivity is finally forged into unshakable strength. The silence ceases to be a weapon of manipulation and becomes a monument to self-respect. When the noise finally fades, only one truth remains. You cannot lose someone who was never truly present. but you can absolutely lose yourself by trying to hold on to a shadow. Protect your baseline. Maintain the boundary. To truly grasp the magnitude of what occurs when an avoidant and an empath simultaneously sever communication, we must first dissect Keynote 1, the breaking of the compliance loop. In the standard architecture of this toxic interpersonal dynamic, there exists a highly predictable, deeply ingrained transactional economy. The empath acts as the primary supplier of emotional currency, validation, and intuitive compliance. They are wired to scan the horizon for micro shifts in the avoidance mood, constantly modifying their own behavior, tone, and emotional output to bridge the chasm left by the avoidance withdrawal. Conversely, the avoidant relies entirely on this predictable pursuit. The empath's frantic bids for connection provide a comfortable subconscious metric for the avoidant. It tells them exactly where the emotional boundaries lie and assures them that they possess the ultimate leverage in the relationship. This is the compliance loop, a systemic, unspoken contract where one party perpetually chases and the other perpetually flees, creating a twisted sense of stability through chaos. When both parties execute the no-contact rule, this entire macro system suffers an immediate, catastrophic disruption. It is the psychological equivalent of pulling the master breaker in a power grid. The predictable behavioral data stream that both individuals use to regulate their internal anxieties is abruptly terminated. For the empath, the sudden cessation of their own output forces an intense internal collapse of their typical operational model. For years, their neurological baseline has been conditioned to project energy outward, to fix, to heal, and to accommodate. When they consciously choose to lock down their borders, that massive reservoir of intuitive energy has nowhere to go. The immediate result is a severe disorientation, a form of cognitive withdrawal where the brain demands the familiar dopamine-cortisol spikes generated by the chase. They are forced to confront the stark, uncomfortable reality of their own compliance, realizing that their hypervigilance was not love, but a highly sophisticated survival mechanism designed to prevent rejection. Simultaneously, this silence strikes a lethal blow to the avoidant's psychological equilibrium. The avoidant's entire ego architecture is predicated on the assumption that the empath is a permanent fixture waiting at the perimeter. They are accustomed to a specific cadence of pursuit. They expect the desperate texts, the emotional appeals, or, at the very least, the subtle digital surveillance from the empath. This expectation allows the avoidant to maintain their aloof facade while secretly feeding off the validation of being pursued. When the empath drops offline entirely, the avoidant's predictive coding model fails. There is no chase to flee from, which means their deactivation strategies no longer have a target to push away. The mirror is suddenly turned directly onto them. Without the empath's emotional noise to blame for their discomfort, the avoidant is trapped in a room with their own core vacuum. The breaking of the loop strips away the illusions both archetypes hid behind, exposing the raw, unvarnished mechanics of their respective attachment injuries. Moving deeper into this psychological forensic analysis brings us directly to Keynote 2, the avoidance baseline phantom phase. To accurately track this timeline, we must understand that the avoidance internal clock operates on a severe psychological delay compared to the empath's. When the silence initially falls, the avoidant experiences what behavioral profiling identifies as an artificial spike in autonomy. Because their primary core wound is a fear of engulfment, the sudden absence of the empath's emotional demands feels like an immense victory. Their nervous system interprets the lack of contact not as a loss, but as the successful restoration of their personal borders. During this initial phase, which typically spans the first 14 days, their cognitive baseline is dominated by a sense of profound relief. They look at the silence and see a validation of their detachment, convinced that they are entirely self-sufficient and that the relationship was the sole source of their psychological friction. They shift their focus entirely to external stimuli, work, superficial social interactions, or hyperfixated hobbies, using these distractions to reinforce the illusion that they are completely unaffected by the severed bond. However, human psychology operates on strict systemic laws, and this artificial autonomy has a definitive expiration date. As the timeline ticks past the 3-week mark into the critical 30-day metric, the avoidance deactivation defenses begin to starve from a lack of emotional fuel. For a deactivation strategy to remain functional, it requires an active threat to push against. It requires the empath to be actively knocking at the door. When the empath maintains absolute, flawless silence, there is no pressure to resist. The avoidance subconscious mind suddenly experiences a catastrophic error in its predictive coding model. The underlying narrative that kept them feeling safe, the belief that the empath is sitting at home, broken, pining, and waiting for their return, begins to rapidly decay. Without the empath's pursuit to validate their position of power, the avoidant enters the true phantom phase. This is the precise tipping point where their internal metrics invert, and the relief they fiercely guarded mutates into an invasive, low-grade systemic anxiety. The silence shifts from a protective shield into a cold, clinical mirror that reflects their deepest flaw, their total inability to sustain authentic human connection. They begin to experience a phenomenon known as separation anxiety delay. While the empath was doing the heavy lifting of processing the raw grief in the first 2 weeks, the avoidant is only now hitting the shoreline of reality. The suppression mechanisms they relied on begin to fail, allowing repressed memories of the empath's warmth, loyalty, and emotional safety to flood their cognitive architecture. They become intensely hypervigilant, scanning the environment for any data point that proves the empath still cares. They will subtly check read receipts, monitor online statuses, or ask mutual contacts casual, disguised questions to gauge the empath's location. The stark realization sets in that the empath has not merely given them space, they have actively withdrawn their presence from the board. The phantom of what they threw away begins to haunt their psychological baseline, forcing them to confront the terrifying truth that their avoidance strategies didn't protect them from being controlled. It simply ensured that they ended up entirely abandoned. We must now pivot our analytical lens to the opposite side of the board to dissect Keynote 3, the empath's neurological lockdown. When an intuitive individual finally crosses the threshold from a wounded, reactive state into a position of strategic self-containment, their entire energetic and behavioral architecture undergoes a massive structural overhaul. Historically, the empath's default operational setting within the relationship was one of chaotic emotional output. They operated under the subconscious delusion that if they could just find the right words, project enough warmth, or display enough transparency, they could regulate the avoidance nervous system and cure the emotional distance. This constant outward projection of energy kept the empath in a state of perpetual neurological hyperarousal, leaving them highly vulnerable to the avoidant partner's pull-push dynamics. However, when the empath enters true, unshakable no contact, this chaotic dispersion of emotional energy is forced into an immediate clinical lockdown. This transition is not passive. It is an active, systemic redirection of psychological resources. In the initial phase of the lockdown, the empath experiences an intense neurobiological withdrawal, as their brain has become accustomed to the high-stakes chemical spikes of the chase and flee cycle. But instead of allowing this pain to drive them back into compliance, the healed empath treats this withdrawal as a purely physical metric to be managed. They implement a strict embargo on all emotional exports. They consciously choose to stop projecting their intuitive empathy onto a blank, unreceptive canvas. They stop trying to read the avoidance mind. They stop predicting the avoidance needs, and most importantly, they stop holding space for someone who refuses to occupy it. This shift from external tracking to internal containment effectively starves the toxic dynamic of its primary source of fuel. The empath constructs an impenetrable behavioral perimeter, treating their attention, their validation, and their emotional insights as premium assets that are permanently off the market. By weaponizing their attention through absolute withdrawal, the empath effectively changes the physics of the entire relationship matrix. They transition from a variable that can be manipulated or predicted by the avoidant into a fixed, immovable coordinate. This internal lockdown requires a brutal, realistic inventory of why they were willing to tolerate such low-leverage dynamics in the first place, forcing them to realize that their hypersensitivity was being exploited as an emotional buffer for someone else's unhealed attachment trauma. As the weeks progress, the neurological pathways that were once dedicated to tracking the avoidant begin to prune and recalibrate. The empath's nervous system drops its cortisol levels and exits the survival state of fight or flight, replacing it with a localized, grounded sense of self-sovereignty. They no longer measure their value by how much neglect they can endure or how much emotional distance they can bridge. By locking down their boundaries and refusing to emit a single microsignal of availability, the empath transforms their core sensitivity from an open vulnerability into a highly disciplined, sovereign shield. To completely map the endgame of this silent standoff, we must analyze the behavioral forensics of Keynote 4, the covert proxemic shifts. Proxemics, in a behavioral profiling context, refers to the psychological use of space and distance to communicate power, intent, and emotional state. In the standard phase of a relationship, proxemics are direct, physical proximity, verbal reassurance, or clear rejection. But when a healed empath executes a flawless neurological lockdown and maintains an absolute data blackouts, the avoidance internal mapping system experiences a crisis. They can no longer use direct methods of communication because doing so would require vulnerability, which their ego structure explicitly prohibits as an existential threat. Therefore, as their internal anxiety peaks due to the total absence of the empath's validation, the avoidant is forced to deploy a series of low-exposure, highly calculated behavioral probes. These are not attempts at reconciliation. They are covert proxemic shifts designed to test the strength of the empath's perimeter without risking an overt rejection. The mechanics of these covert probes are highly predictable and follow a distinct gradient of escalation. It begins in the digital ecosystem, where the avoidant will subtly adjust their online distance. They might view an old social media story within seconds of it being posted, intentionally cross into the empath's digital line of sight by unmuting them, or leave a passive-aggressive, ambiguous status update designed to trigger the empath's intuitive curiosity. These are digital bids for attention, microsignals sent into the void to see if the empath is still actively monitoring them. If the digital probes yield no data because the empath remains completely unresponsive, the avoidant will escalate to physical and social proxemic shifts. They may suddenly begin frequenting a specific coffee shop, gym, or social gathering space that they previously avoided but know is central to the empath's daily routine. By placing their physical body within the empath's geographic orbit, they are attempting to force a non-verbal confrontation, trying to read the empath's micro-expressions, posture, and baseline changes to see if the emotional compliance loop is still intact. These covert proxemic shifts serve as a diagnostic tool for the avoidance ego. They are looking for a crack in the armor, a lingering look, a slight hesitation in stride, a mutual friend reporting that the empath asked about them, or a direct message demanding to know why they are showing up. Any reaction from the empath, even a negative one, acts as a psychological transaction that resets the avoidant's internal timer. It proves to the avoidant that they still possess real estate inside the empath's mind, effectively relieving their anxiety and allowing them to retreat back into safe detachment. This is why understanding this phase is so critical for the empath's strategic defense. The avoidant is essentially fishing for a baseline response, using these ambiguous, low-risk maneuvers to gauge whether the empath's silence is merely a temporary tactical punishment or a permanent structural boundary. If the empath fails to recognize these shifts as covert probes and misinterprets them as genuine signs of emotional growth or a desire to connect, they will inevitably break their own lockdown, stepping right back into the path of a highly predictable cycle of avoidant deactivation. This brings our structural breakdown to its final, definitive resolution with Keynote 5, the sovereignty threshold. In the timeline of any strategic silence, there is an invisible line where the utility of the behavior completely transforms. Initially, when both the avoidant and the empath enter no contact, the silence is almost always used as a tactical negotiation tool. On a subconscious level, even an empath who is deeply hurt is often using the absence of communication as a mechanism to shock the avoidant into recognizing their value, hoping the distance will force an awakening. It is a period characterized by high internal tension, active boundary maintenance, and a constant monitoring of one's own resolve. But as the lockdown phase endures and the empath successfully filters out the avoidant's covert proxemic probes, a profound psychological mutation occurs. The silence ceases to be an external tactic designed to elicit a reaction from the other person, and instead turns inward, hardening into a permanent structural foundation of self-sovereignty. Crossing this threshold requires the empath to completely detach from the outcome of the game itself. They stop counting the days of no contact. They stop treating the timeline as a countdown to a potential reunion or a final showdown. The behavioral metrics shift entirely from an outward focus on the avoidant's psychological collapse to an inward focus on their own psychological architecture. The empath realizes that the very act of waiting for the avoidant to change or blink is itself a form of lingering compliance. True sovereignty is achieved when the empath no longer requires the avoidant to acknowledge the boundary for the boundary to be real. The silence is no longer an angry wall built to punish the avoidant. It becomes a holy sanctuary built to protect the empath's peace. At this exact coordinate, the empath's nervous system completes its recalibration, moving entirely out of the hypervigilant survival baseline that defined the relationship and entering a state of unshakable emotional autonomy. For the avoidant, the empath crossing the sovereignty threshold is an absolute structural disaster. Up until this point, the avoidant's ego could always console itself with the belief that the empath's silence was born out of anger or pain, both of which are emotional tethers that imply the connection is still alive. But when the empath hits the sovereignty threshold, the energy radiating from them shifts from active resentment to total indifference. Indifference is a metric that cannot be negotiated, manipulated, or probed. When the avoidant deploys their usual low-exposure behaviors or indirect bids, they no longer hit a wall of resistant energy, they hit absolute nothingness. The avoidant is forced into a state of total psychological deflation, realizing that their avoidance didn't just buy them space, it cost them the entire asset.